Welcome to No Nonsense Nonprofits. Hi, I'm Sandy Ray, founder of Sandra E. Ray, CPA, where we alleviate financial headaches so that you can create a bigger impact. Today, I want to welcome Edgar Jattu of Ophicium is here to provide us with insights into human resource processes and procedures that we need to have in place. Originally from Cameroon, Edgar was raised in New York City, and he's passionate about creating workplaces that value fair treatment, trust, and open communication. Edgar also embraces change and the opportunity that it brings, and it helps him connect with individuals dealing with difficult obstacles. Edgar is a practice employment attorney. He's practiced law for 9 years, including managing his own law firm. And as a lawyer, he's advised, represented, and counseled clients in federal, nonprofit, and private sectors. He also has experience in all phases of administrative proceedings and lawsuits involving claims under federal, state, and local employment laws. Edgar's client lists include workers, chartered schools, tutoring companies, construction firms, restaurants, IT companies, and other business owners. He's developed a wide knowledge base to assist his clients in making competent human resource decisions and to guide them in enhancing their brand. Edgar's experience has given him a perspective on how addressing a client's needs using a holistic, creative, and reasoned approach. In his free time, Edgar is a big sports fan, podcast listener, and follows current events and politics. Welcome, Edgar. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's quite an impressive resume. If you don't mind, I'd really like to just dive right into the questions because we do have a limited time, and I want to give you all the opportunity to convey as much information to everyone as we possibly can.
Sure thing.
Great. So my first question is, what are the main responsibilities of a human resource professional, especially in a nonprofit organization?
Yeah, the main responsibilities is to help the organization manage its human capital. That can include many different ways, one of which is compliance, so ensuring that the organization is following local, state, and federal law when making human resources decisions and thinking through strategy. Another way would be helping with personnel items, particularly day-to-day personnel items. So oftentimes HR is the one that is responsible for hearing complaints from employees, figuring out a way to resolve those complaints or inquiries from employees. If there's a dispute between employees or workers or management, HR is usually on the forefront of trying to help resolve that dispute. Anything dealing with benefits or compensation, HR has a major say in ensuring that compensation benefits are fair across the board, that they're in line with the market, and that there's a strategy over time to improving compensation benefits for retention of key employees, especially. And also, when it comes to strategy and growth, there's a common misconception that HR is sort of a siloed business function, but quite the opposite. It's very much embedded in the operations of an organization, even a nonprofit. And so as a nonprofit is looking to grow or to change its mission or expand its staff, HR is very much part of that decision-making, because as you make changes in your organization, that can have impacts on HR, right? HR has to be at the table to ensure that the HR impact is addressed with any changes that an organization is looking to make.
Yeah, I agree. As we grow, it's the people in our organization that drive what we're doing and drive our mission. We need to really be focused on how we're treating those people and that we're in compliance. So thank you for that.
Yep.
So kind of a follow-up to that is, as we're putting new people in place and processes in place, are there any particular policies or procedures that we should have in place in our nonprofit organizations as it relates to human resources?
Yeah, one thing is that there are many policy and procedures that any employer should have, right? So anything dealing with For example, workplace conduct, what can get you disciplined for poor performance or poor behavior as an employee, things about business conduct. So there are a lot of different standard policies that all employers should have. But for nonprofit especially, one thing that I encounter a lot with my nonprofit clients is how to effectively manage volunteers. A lot of times people don't see it as something to worry about, but when you have volunteers, you want to ensure that they're volunteering for the thing that you want them to volunteer for, right? They're not volunteering for something that you don't need for them to volunteer for, or that falls outside the scope of your volunteer program, right? And there are instances where an employee of a nonprofit would volunteer for the nonprofit as well. And it's not a cut and dry rule. There are rules around how you do that properly, because if an employee is volunteering in the very work that they're doing as an employee, that can create many compliance issues. So you have to ensure that if you have employees volunteer for your organization, that they are volunteering in something that's different than what they're being paid for by your organization, right? So that's another thing that as a nonprofit, you have to be keenly aware about in terms of what your obligations are to individuals. So one thing that I always tell nonprofits to do is, when you're thinking through your policy procedures, you want to make sure you have something specifically for volunteers, because in a way they are staff for you, but very specialized group of staff person. But you have to treat them as such, right? Because if you're not careful, you might find yourself in a compliance issue. And also, one of the big things I always preach is reputation management, and HR is an extension of that. And you don't want to be seen, whether it's internally or externally, as someone or an organization that does not treat people well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know what? We've kind of touched on the role of volunteers in previous live sessions, so I'm so glad that you brought that up, and it really hadn't considered having a policy for volunteers. So I think that's a very good point. Thank you.
Yep.
So my next question is, the human resources function in nonprofit organizations, are they significantly different than for-profit entities, or are they similar in many ways, or can you elaborate on that?
I would say they're similar in many ways, in that, in terms of the training you need, and in terms of understanding the overall environment that you're operating in as an HR professional, in terms of the compliance and understanding the organization itself. I think the major difference is that, one, you might have to do with volunteers, which you just talked about, but also nonprofits sometimes, or most of the time, have finite resources, right? There's only so much that nonprofits can do in terms of the resources they have, right? And so obviously that can be different depending on the size of the organization. But even so, nonprofits are very conscious about their financing and money, right? And as an HR professional working with a nonprofit, you have to be aware of that. And when you're giving advice or helping a nonprofit organization think through an issue, you have to remember the fact that there's limited resources of people's time and actual budget, right? For example, when I do recruiting work for nonprofits, I have to be really creative around how I spend money for that nonprofit to recruit for a position, right? There's only a certain amount of money they have devoted to recruitment. Or even when you're doing compensation studies for base salary and benefits, you have to do a market analysis and look at the size of a nonprofit compared to other nonprofits of similar size. But at the end of the day, it just comes down to, what can a nonprofit afford, right? You have to take that into account when doing a compensation study, for example. So I think that's probably the major difference between working with a for-profit entity and a nonprofit entity, is that, yes, everyone has to worry about resources, but I think for nonprofits, it's a little different. And the other wrinkle is that you have a board to deal with, right? And as a nonprofit professional, it's not just the executive director that you're working with or the senior leadership team, it's also the board, right? Sometimes HR issues involve the board of directors, whether it's helping to fulfill certain key senior level positions, such as an executive director, or if there's an HR investigation that involves someone in senior leadership, and the board has to get involved in doing the investigation and deciding what to do. And that is a whole different dynamic, because it's different personalities on that board you have to interface with. So that's another wrinkle that you're dealing with when working with nonprofits.
Yeah, I love that, especially the dealing with the board and looking at compensation studies. And to reinforce that, I mean, we have to on the 990 explain that how we have determined that our executive or our highly compensated employees, their salaries were determined to make sure that it's reasonable. That's a great point. And then definitely limited resources and the board's role in the whole thing is
Right.
definitely unique to nonprofits. Are there any other common challenges faced by managers in nonprofit organizations, or do you think we've kind of covered it all?
The one other thing that I would mention is that a common thing that you'll see as an HR professional work with nonprofits is burnout. Nonprofits, particularly if they're very mission driven, there's a lot of work that nonprofit is put into carrying out the mission. And a lot of times you see burnout, right? And here's the thing, many people who work for nonprofits don't do it for the money, do it because they care about the mission and of the organization or just being in of service to people or to a cause. And for many people, the hours they put in, they don't always see it as work. But at the end of the day, everyone has a limit, right? And I think one thing nonprofits always have to think through is work-life balance and how to ensure that people feel valued for the work they do, particularly for all those hours they're putting in, not being paid what they could be paid on the open market, right, for their skill sets and expertise. So one thing that we work on a lot with our nonprofit clients is, yes, we do the compliance stuff and everything that an HR person or the basic HR and services, but we also talk at length about health and wellness in the workplace and creating a culture where it's talked about and addressed, because it's a big issue. It's always been a big issue, but I think now at least it's getting more lip service and attention. And it's something we work on a lot with our nonprofit clients in particular, because there's only so much benefits they can offer many times, because again, there's limited resources. What can we do to make sure that we are paying attention to retention? We're keeping people, if they're happy here, they feel valued, taking time off as they need to. And a couple of things that I've seen work over time is building in sabbatical periods for certain people if they've been with you for a set number of years, so they can either do something in the field or just time away from work. One thing that I've worked with organizations is setting up a series, basically a bonus structure for certain frontline nonprofit employees, because sometimes for some organizations, their compensation is capped because they must get certain social services. It's not an option, it's they have to have it because of certain medical issues they're dealing with. And so they can only make so much in a year and forfeit those social services. So we worked on building in some health and wellness perks if you perform at a certain level in your performance review. So we try to be creative when it comes to this issue.
Well, that's a wonderful point, because we hate losing our experienced people. I mean, forget about the cost of retraining someone new, just all that experience and history when someone burns out and actually leaves the organization permanently. It's just so hard on the organization. I think a lot of times it's hard on the person that's leaving as well. So wonderful points about that. Thank you for sharing that. My last question is, do you have any recommendations for tools that we can use in our nonprofit organizations to help us with our HR management?
Yes, so I'm a big fan of ensuring that my clients are using even just basic software. So for any nonprofit out there, I just highly recommend that you have a payroll company that you work with, or an accountant or a bookkeeper you work with to handle payroll. I think that is a number one way you can find yourself in compliance issues if you don't have that nailed down. And there are many things out there, as you know, Sandy, there are many options out there. There's no reason why you shouldn't have something for payroll set in place. And oftentimes, sometimes with the payroll companies that you use, they also have a human resource information software attached to it, where you can store employee records and keep track of documentation. And that's another area where if you don't do that effectively, you can run yourself again into having compliance issues. It's, because some HR documents have to be maintained a certain way. And if you don't do that, then and if you investigate, you can get a fine for that. So I'm just very adamant that you have a system, whether you do it old school and you keep hard copies in a locked file cabinet, or if you use the cloud, just having a software. So whether it's your payroll company, for a lot of our clients, we just have a Google Drive that we help them maintain, and only us and the senior leadership team that has to have access to it, or a Dropbox account, whatever it is, you have to have something to maintain files, because again, if you don't do it properly, you can get fined for that. Another tool I would recommend, having a way to communicate with folks, whether it's a Slack account or a WhatsApp, particularly in a world where everyone's remote. It's nice to have an easy way to communicate with people. And so I just also recommend that. I'm sure that's not something people would expect me to say. But I do find that one of the biggest problems that we've encountered now in the age of COVID and increasing remote work is, how do people communicate effectively, right? And sometimes email's not the way to communicate. Sometimes you have to do it in other ways, right? And but the challenge is, if you're trying to communicate with more than one person, how do you do that effectively? And I found that for some organizations, Slack works tremendously for that, in terms of getting announcements out there, or helping to cultivate more of a team, a culture of teamwork. Or WhatsApp group can help as well. And the reason why I would advocate for using a platform and not just a text chain is that if you're sharing certain proprietary information or announcements, what have you, you want that protected in some way. And so having like a Slack account or something where it's encrypted and everything stays on the platform is important. So if someone leaves, they can't just take all that information with them easily, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does.
Yeah. Oh, and volunteer management, of course. Just having a way to properly manage volunteers, I think, is also crucial as well.
I'm just taking notes here for myself. Actually. I'm like, these are great ideas. Anything else you want to add to that?
Oh, that's it, I would say. I mean, those are probably the main things. I'm a big believer in not everything has to be very complicated. Sometimes the best advice is a simple advice. And look, you can get all the bells and whistles in the world if you wanted to, right? And I've seen that. And for some organizations, it works, right? It works to have all the software, all the platforms, but sometimes for some organizations, it's not necessary, and particularly if you're a small nonprofit or a nonprofit that doesn't need a lot. I think sometimes the best policy is keeping things simple. Because at the end of the day, you have to administer the HR functions. It's not something that just happens, right? And if you don't have a good process that works for you and the platforms in place that help you carry out your process or your policies, then it just leads to frustration, slower response times, indecisiveness. It's just not a good way. And part of what I do is I look at everything. It's not just setting up the policy and procedures. It's also, how does it get rolled out? If you create a policy or something, well, then how do you implement it? And that's the stuff we work on. And it comes down to, well, what tools you're using to maintain templates and forms. How do people access stuff, right? And that's work we do with the leadership to ensure that it makes sense for the organization and for the leaders that have to, be involved in the processes, and ultimately that the employees are receptive to it too.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, the system is too complicated. My experience is they start bypassing it and they're not really using it. They come up with their own thing. So I love the advice of keeping it simple and so that it is used and implemented and followed. And I think that's wonderful. So just kind of recap today, we've talked about compliance issues, volunteer management, burnout and how to avoid that, increasing our communications with our team, and using some systems that fit our organizations at the size that we're at now, but also look at how we're planning on growing. This information has been so helpful for me. Like I said, I took an entire page of notes myself. I was like, this is a great idea. I hope this information has been as helpful for everyone else as it has been for me. I want to thank Edgar Jattu today of Ophicium, for joining us, for being so generous with his time and his expertise. So thank you, Edgar.
No problem. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed my experience here today.
Oh, thank you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Remember that creating a bigger impact starts with stopping the nonsense. And if you're dealing with nonsense in your nonprofit organization, we'd love to help you cut through the noise.